Finally, today the rebellion will be destroyed. I'm gonna kill you. Oh, okay, back to work. I've got you. Is that you?
Yes, it's me.
Can't you see? I'm stronger than you. Any last words?
A mind is stronger than a muscle.
Wait, what?
My turn now. Prepare to die.
This is Sparta!
Sorry, wrong phrase. Now let's finish it.
Awesome! Did you see how she killed him with her mind power?
Wait, is he really dead?
What? No, they're just acting. Come on. This awesome movie just demonstrated the power of the mind. And in this lesson, we're going to see how the brain can help you resist reflexes through voluntary control. First of all, what exactly is voluntary movement? Voluntary movement is the intentional movement initiated by the internal decision of your brain. Like, for example, this bodybuilder here. When he's flexing his muscles, he's obviously doing that intentionally by decisions taken by the brain. The same thing goes for a dancer, for someone picking up a glass of water from the table, etc. These are not reflexes, these are decision-based movements or voluntary actions. Now let's consider this experiment. This recording shows the electric activity of the extensor muscle during the patellar reflex. The first curve corresponds to the normal myotatic reflex, whereas number 2 corresponds to the myotatic reflex applied when the host voluntarily, meaning through his own decision, has contracted his flexor muscle, the antagonist. What can you conclude from these recordings? Excellent, that's true. We can conclude that the activation of the antagonist muscle voluntarily can reduce or attenuate the myotatic reflex, meaning that the brain can actually control these reflexes or interfere in their response. Now let's consider the voluntary flexion of the leg and the corresponding nervous circuit which controls it. For the brain to control the activity of the flexor muscles of the leg, there are actually descending motor pathways in the spinal cord, which form synapses within the spinal cord with the motor fibers that are already connected with the flexor muscles. So these descending motor fibers activate through an excitatory synapse the motor fibers of the flexor muscle, and then these in turn carry nerve messages towards the muscle. By a neuromuscular synapse here, we have excitation of the muscular fibers, which then contract and the leg is flexed. Now let's consider both muscles of the leg, the antagonist muscles, the flexor and the extensor. Again, we're trying to activate the flexor, but as you know, this requires simultaneous inactivation of the extensor muscle. And to control it, we know that it has its own motor fibers connected to the spinal cord. We need to inhibit those. So the brain actually has another branch from the descending motor fibers which will try to inactivate those of the extensor muscle. And to do that, we have interneurons which are activated by the brain and in turn inactivate the motor fibers of the extensor. In that way, the motor fibers of the flexor are receiving input through an excitatory synapse to activate the flexor muscle, while those of the extensor muscle are being inhibited through an inhibitory synapse by the interneuron activated by the brain, so that the extensor relaxes, the flexor contracts, and there, voila. Now comes the best part, the myotatic reflex represented by Thor and his mighty hammer versus the voluntary control represented by Master Yoda and his mind power. Let us first consider the myotatic reflex working on its own. So if you recall well from the previous videos, after hitting the patellar tendon, the extensor muscle is stretched and its neuromuscular spindles are activated. This sends a train of afferent messages, the action potentials here, towards the spinal cord. and this activates the motor fibers connected to the same muscle, the extensor, and an interneuron, which in turn inactivates the motor fibers of the flexor muscle, the antagonist. This allows sending nervous messages, efferent messages, towards the extensor to stimulate its contraction so that the leg is extended, and as you can see here, the ball was kicked. Now let's superpose the nervous circuit which controls the voluntary flexion of the leg over that of the myotatic reflex of the extensor. So you notice that that of the myotatic reflex starts from the extensor muscle, from a neuromuscular spindle, goes towards the spinal cord through sensory fibers, and then returns to the same muscle through the motor fibers connected to the extensor. Whereas that of the voluntary control of the flexor originate or start from the brain, from the encephalon, the superior control centers, and they descend by motor fibers towards the spinal cord. After that, they act on the motor fibers of the flexor. However, these two circuits are not independent. They actually cross, as you can see clearly in this diagram. Now let's test these two circuits against one another. In the first case, we're going to have slight voluntary flexion prior to myotatic reflex. So in other words, as you can see here, the leg is slightly bent inward, and this is induced by orders from the brain. So you can see that the brain is already sending some input, some efferent messages towards the spinal cord, and this is activating the motor fibers of the flexor, while at the same time inactivating the motor fiber of the extensor through its interneuron. So now let's start with the myotatic reflex. We hit the patellar tendon, the muscle, the extensor muscle is stretched, its neuromuscular spindle is activated and sends afferent messages through the sensory fibers towards the spinal cord. So you see this train of action potentials going towards the spinal cord. Now what's going to happen? It is supposed to activate the motor fiber connected to the same muscle, this one here. So we have an EPSP, or an excitatory synapse, with its own motor fiber, in addition to an excitatory synapse with another interneuron that should inhibit the motor fiber of the extensor. So now you see that each motor neuron is receiving two opposite inputs from each circuit. A reciprocal input. One is trying to activate them, the other is trying to inhibit them. So what's the solution? Well, you already studied something called synaptic integration or nervous integration. And this is what these two motor fibers will exhibit. Let's focus on the one of the extensor first. So it was already receiving an IPSP through an inhibitory synapse from the interneuron activated by the superior control. So let's say, consider this wave as the IPSP. Now it's receiving an EPSP through the sensory fiber, which is activated by the myotatic reflex. So supposedly that this input now is has a higher amplitude, and remember that we said that the voluntary flexion is slight. So the IPSP is not that strong; its amplitude is quite small. So what should happen? Through spatial summation, this motor fiber integrates the two inputs, and supposedly we get a smaller EPSP. This is the algebraic summation of the two waves. So what's the result? Now, this motor fiber does indeed send the action potentials, efferent messages. However, notice that the number of action potentials, the frequency, is quite smaller than before when we studied the myotatic reflex on its own. So what's the result in this case? The extensor would contract, however, the contraction is less significant. Notice that in this case, the foot wasn't able to reach the ball. So we can say that the voluntary control by the brain was able to reduce or attenuate the effect of the myotatic reflex. Finally, let's consider the case where the voluntary flexion is a bit stronger. So you can see that the leg is bent a bit more here, as the brain is sending a higher frequency of action potentials towards the motor fiber of the flexor. So if we start the myotatic reflex, the same steps, it's still sending through its sensory fiber the same frequency of action potentials, the same input. But this time, this motor fiber of the extensor is receiving an IPSP of a much higher amplitude because the input from the brain is stronger. So if we add the EPSP from the myotatic reflex through spatial summation, we obtain this time something like a small IPSP. So this means that the motor fiber of the extensor will not carry any more action potentials, and the extensor simply will not contract. as if the myotatic reflex did not happen at all. So in other words, the leg will remain flexed, and the voluntary control was able to completely cancel out the myotatic reflex.